So in person, this look is a bit more Snow White in a gritty teen reboot, but I think in the camera it comes across as a little more like I still believe in Santa. Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. So it is Libra season. I think we are smack bang in the middle of it now, which goes from the 23rd of September to the 23rd of October. And as a Libra myself, I thought it would be fun to recommend some books that I think would be appropriate for Libras. Now, before we begin, I am not an expert by any means in the Zodiac. I don't know anything about signs that aren't my own, really. And I also wouldn't exactly call myself someone who believes in it. I certainly don't really go in for horoscopes or anything, but I do think it's fun sometimes to discuss, to see the way that these things are like you or not like you. And of course, as a Libra, I could just say all of my favourite books are books for Libras, but I think I have chosen 14 books that I think fit with the idea that the internet has given me about what a Libra is. So Libra is the scales, the only zodiac sign to be represented by an inanimate object, which is kind of rude, actually, but apparently we're supposed to symbolise balance, and by balance we mean ambivalence and not being able to choose a side. Libras are also fundamentally oriented towards justice and supporting the underdog, and also are one of the air signs, which means they are the aesthetes of the zodiac. We love beauty. Anything aesthetically pleasing is pleasing to a Libra. According to CoStar Astrology, which is of course every queer's favourite astrology website, we hate being alone, really good aesthetics, conflict avoidant, sees every side, prone to fantasy, and can't make decisions. We'd also apparently be good socialites, Instagram models, and muses, which I guess means we're good at being looked at, but not participating. Regardless, as I said, I'm not an expert in any of this, but I have 14 things that I think fit that justice-oriented, beauty-minded Libra. The first book on my list is Persuasion by Jane Austen. Now, when I was doing research for this video, a lot of people said Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, so I think that Regency period aesthetic really works for beauty-loving Libras, but I would say argue Persuasion is better than Pride and Prejudice. I mean, as I've already said, Libras are very easily persuaded by people, so I think that we could relate to Anne Elliot, the main character in Persuasion. At 19, Anne Elliot was proposed to, but she turned him down because one of her family friends persuaded her against it. The man who proposed was beneath her in rank and didn't have a fortune, as well as Anne being very young herself. But when we start the novel, we are 8 years later. Anne is 27 years old and very, very old to be unmarried. Her father, who is a lord and an aesthete himself, obsessed with status and appearances, has spent frivolously their money, and so they have to rent out their big stately home and go and live somewhere smaller in Bath. While her father and older sister go off to Bath, Anne herself goes to live with her other married sister for a while. But the people that they rent their house out to turn out to be Captain Wentworth, is the man who proposed to her all those years ago, although now he has made fame and fortune in the Navy. So Persuasion then turns into a second chance romance. Anne meets Captain Wentworth but thinks he could never see her in the same way again because his pride has been hurt and she thinks he is moving on. It's one of Austen's more melancholy and I would say romantic, in the capital R sense of romantic, books. And if you'd like to hear more about the romantic period, I have a video where I discuss it in relation to Wuthering Heights up there. This book discusses poetry and beauty and love and constancy and of the relationships between the sexes, as well as still having that same social satire that you expect from Jane Austen. Next on my list is poetry, or specifically a poet. Any of the collections by this poet I think would suit a Libra's aesthetic sensibility, and that is Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver writes poetry that are a lot to do with nature, a lifelong passion for solitary walks. It's characterised by sincere wonderment at the beauty in the world, which I think is a Libra trait. Although the language is more simple and unadorned than some other poetry, I think that it is really, really beautiful in its simplicity. And I think that real awe and wonder nature is something that aesthetically minded Libras would appreciate. It's hard to know if you would like a poet without having read the words of the poet, so I'm going to read one of her most famous poems to you just so you can get an idea. This is called Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscape, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. I think even that first line, you do not have to be good. As Libras are known for being slightly perfectionistic, seeing things in black and white, I think that you do not have to be good is a good message for a Libra. For anyone, really. Number 3 on my list is Normal People by Sally Rooney, a beautifully written love story. Libras are ruled by the planet Venus, which is the planet of love, so I think that love stories definitely work for that, and the beauty of this too, and also the way that it is about the differences between people, about class and social position. Normal People, if you don't know, tells the story of Connell and Marianne, 2 young people growing up in rural Ireland around the time of the financial crisis and the collapse of the Celtic Tiger. They go to the same school, but Connell is popular and working class. Marianne is from a well-off family, but she's kind of a weird outside loner. They get together, but they keep their dating secret. Then we flash forward to the future, where they have both gone to Trinity College Dublin, one of the oldest universities in the country, and where their social standing and their experience changes. It's a very internalised book about the thoughts and feelings of Connell and Marianne as they move through their world, and it is a book that ebbs and flows between the two of them, where the perspective changes very smoothly over the course of the book. It deals a lot with mental health, with the difficulties of communicating and the ways that we self-sabotage, and it also deals with class relations in Ireland in the 2010s in particular. It's a very popular book, although a little Marmite, but I do think that it is beautiful and slow-moving and understated. Next on my list is a middle grade book to appeal to Libra's sense of fantasy, and that is The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherynne M. Valente. This tells the story of September, a girl who is living in America in the 1940s and is ravished away to Fairyland by the West Wind, I think. It's one of the winds, and she ends up in this wonderful land that combines a lot of ideas from fairy stories, and she ends up on a quest to try and save Fairyland from the dictator who is ruling over it. It is a very verbose word play kind of a book. There's lots of plays on traditional ideas of fairy tales and lots of fantastic elements. It gives me kind of Phantom Tollbooth vibes in some ways, because it's playing with literal meanings of things, and it is exploring a world that is full of whimsy. It is a book that, despite me listening to the audiobook and so seeing no pictures or anything, it's a very visual book with a lot of rich description and really fun, beautiful words to sink your teeth into. And I think all of those things mean that it would be appropriate for Libras who love beauty and fantasy. Another beautiful book, and one that talks about justice and the injustice of the justice system, is Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. This is set in the Deep South in America and is a very small story about a family. We hear from the perspectives of Leonie, who is a woman who is addicted to drugs, her son Jojo, and his relationship with his sister and his mother as they travel up the state to meet his father, who has just been released from prison. We also hear from the perspective of his grandfather, who was imprisoned in the middle of the 20th century in that same prison. We hear through the stories of the ghosts that haunt the prison what happened there in the past. It's a very beautiful and moving book. The passages told from Leonie's point of view really read like prose poetry, and it's also includes some of the most wonderful, tender relationships in fiction, particularly that between Jojo and his little sister, which is heartbreaking because the way he tenderly cares for her and looks after her, he is her primary caregiver, despite the fact that he is a child himself. It's really a book focused on justice or injustice, both through the carceral system and through the killing of black men, through the way police violence is enacted, the way that poverty is a cycle that people are kept in, and the way that history still affects people living today and has had a direct impact on people who are still around. It is a book with a lot of sadness in it. Jojo's grandma is very, very ill, but also so much beauty and tenderness that I think it's really fit for Libras. Another book that has those fairy tale themes, but a little darker this time, and it is a collection of short stories, which is What Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. This is a collection of kind of dark fairy tale short stories, some of which are retellings of tales that exist already. There are a few retellings of Pinocchio and one of Little Red Riding Hood, as well as some that have those fairy tale elements, but I at least couldn't directly relate them to a fairy tale. It has the perfect balance of darkness and whimsy that I think really relates to traditional fairy tales, and the worlds are built with such lightness. In such a short story you get a really strong feel of the world that we are in, and everything feels very alive, even though it's not given as much space and fleshed out as you would expect from a novel, because obviously it's much shorter. There are weird elements of fabulism sprinkled throughout. You're never quite sure what is real and what is going to turn out to be more magical. There are puppets who may be possibly real boys, and kingdoms where one by one the king murders everyone. Whilst there is always the beauty and the whimsy and the comedy, they are quite funny stories, keeping it light. There is always a really dark, twisted, perilous underpinning. I read Revenge by Yoko Ogawa, and I feel like they're similar, except that What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours is much more beautiful and less mundane than Yoko Ogawa, but if you like one, I think you would like the other. Another book that I would recommend is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Partly I would recommend this because it is definitely a book about the extreme failings of vanity, but also because there is in the most editions, I think, this essay that Oscar Wilde wrote about art right at the very beginning, that I think is wonderful, and I think if you are interested in beauty and art for its own sake, I think it really works. Oscar Wilde is a very funny writer, and this is a little gothic novel about Dorian Gray, a beautiful man who was painted by a painter, obviously, who had his portrait painted and decided he wanted to look like that in that painting forever. And somehow this comes apart, but because his lifestyle will leave no mark on his face and nobody will ever be able to tell just from looking at him, it leads him down some very dark paths. Like I said, Oscar Wilde is a very funny and satirical writer, and also one who writes with a great deal of beauty. It's very ornate, this gothic writing, I think, but in a accessible way, definitely. If you're not a classics reader, I think that The Picture of Dorian Gray is one that would work for people who don't often read it. Also, if you're interested in the opulent underbelly of London in the late 19th century, then I think this would be a wonderful one to read for that reason. Another gothic novel that I think Libras would love, we are most of us born in October after all, the spooky season, is The Betrayals by Bridget Collins. This is a story told over 2 timelines and set at a school in the middle of the 20th century in an alternate history. So it is kind of about the rise of the Nazis, but they're never called Nazis because it's not like our actual world, but it's about this elite school where people go to learn the game, le grand jeu. And so it's kind of a fantasy dark academia book, but the fantasy itself is very light. Le grand jeu itself, the way it is described is as a game played with magic and music and physics, but it's not really on the page. So whilst it feels like a fantasy element, nothing on the page that happens could not happen in real life, if that makes sense. So as I said, we follow 2 time periods. One is during the 1930s, during the rise of this fascist party in an alternate Europe, where one man has been kicked out of the party for objecting to the way that things were developing, and he is sent back to his old school to kind of hide out there for a while. One of the games masters there is now a woman, which has never been seen before at the school. Only men are allowed to play. And we kind of see the machinations of this party and the way they're trying to get him out and the way they're trying to change the world. We also have a period set about 10 years beforehand, again at the same school, with a boy who is kind of an outsider, not as posh as the other people at the school, and this other boy who is very kind of insufferable and keeps to himself, and they kind of hate each other, but they end up having to work together, and you can see where things go from there. Although I was a little disappointed by one of the twists in this book, the atmosphere itself is so perfect, and it is really, really beautifully written. If you are looking for that dark academia setting, I think The Betrayals is 100% there for you. This castle in the mountains in the winter, and these very elite school with a lot of competition involved, people who hate each other, bullying, all sorts of terrible events that happen, and violence. I think it is wonderful, and the main character, our narrator, is quite unreliable, kind of you're not sure how you feel about him for a lot of the book, so the mystery really pulls you on as well. And of course there is a weird gothic element, moments told from the perspective of this mouse, and altogether it is a wonderfully atmospheric, compelling book. Another book that is atmospheric and also I would say compelling is The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. This is set in an island off the north coast of Norway called Finnmark in the early 17th century. And on this island, most of the men died when out fishing during a storm, and so the women are having to fend for themselves. But the King of Denmark, which runs Norway at the time, is currently on a rampage against witches, and it sends someone north to explore, to find out what is going on in this community of women by themselves. The man he sends north on his way picks up a wife and takes her with him. This is a very slow moving book, very much about the relationships between people in this small isolated community where everyone knows each other. It is about judgment and it is about witch trials. So as you would expect, it is about justice, it is about injustice, and there is, whilst a lot of it is very slow moving, very beautiful, very atmospheric, you really feel the time period and the setting, and it's very bleak. I love books set in bleak, isolated places. I have a whole video about that I will leave in the cards above, and I think, yeah, the beautiful writing and the atmosphere is wonderful, and the things that aren't said between the people in this book is also really wonderful, and the tension, and towards the end it's really sort of ramps up with this feeling of tension and fear, and although Libras are oriented towards justice, I think that injustice can make a very compelling read if justice is something that you are caring about. So I think that the way that the people gang up on women, and the treatment of the Sami people as well, it's just the scapegoating of them is just so wonderfully done in a way that gives you like goosebumps and keeps you on the edge of your seat. Another one that is very much about justice is The Yield by Tara June Winch. This is a book set in Australia over, again, 2 time periods, about a girl who has gone back to Australia because her grandfather Poppy has passed away, and he, it turns out, during his lifetime was writing a dictionary of Wiradjuri words. So he is a Wiradjuri man. This is about Aboriginal Australians, and so we have 3 different perspectives here. We have a account written by a missionary in the early 20th century, and the mission that he set up, and then also we have Poppy telling his life story in the middle of the 20th century, and then we have after he has passed away, his daughter who has returned, and we find out why during her childhood, what happened that made her want to leave, and also about the campaign to save the house that her parents lived on by claiming native land rights, but they need evidence to do so. So it's very much about the treatment of and the lives of Aboriginal Australians throughout the course of the 20th and early 21st century. This book is another one that really evokes an atmosphere. You really feel the landscape that you are in, and it is one with such incredibly warm, lovely characters that you feel so attached to. Poppy, the voice of Poppy, is so wonderful. Of course, again, there are moments of injustice and of terrible, terrible things happening, of basically genocide being committed in the earlier parts set further back in history, but still injustices on into the future. And it is another book about like miscommunication and people who can't talk about things that have happened in the past, things that are swept under the rug, and cycles of abuse and trauma as well. It also includes a dictionary of Wiradjuri language, with like elements of real life that with real life examples woven into these definitions that really felt wonderfully poetic and warm, and those are the ones told from Poppy's perspective that I thought was so lovely. There was also kind of a mystery involved, so there is plot that pulls you through this, but most of it is about family relationships and the characters that are built. It's a really complex, subtle book that really builds to explore the horrible treatment of Aboriginal Australian people and the injustices still committed to this day, and is about the ways that colonialism wipes out a history and a culture, and the reclamation of what should never have been lost in the first place. Now, since we're talking about justice and history, I think a non-fiction on this topic that is wonderfully conversationally and beautifully written is also something that I think could appeal to a lot of Libras. And so I would recommend Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor. If you are going to read this, I would also recommend the audiobook. It is read by Tharoor himself, and he has such a wonderful voice, and it really helps to get across the tone and the humour that he is using, even when discussing, as well as the serious topics. Inglorious Empire's subtitle is What the British Did to India, and it was sparked by Shashi Tharoor being invited to a debate at Oxford about whether the British should pay reparations for the damages inflicted by Empire. And he goes through a lot of the arguments about what the good the Empire did for the countries that it colonised, and argues against them. For example, yes, maybe trains are useful to have, but they were built with essentially slave labour, and also they were not built for the Indian people, but to extract the wealth from India and take it back to Britain. He talks about a lot of history, stuff that I didn't know, for example, about the British East India Company and smashing up machines so that the Indians who were famous for weaving and for manufacturing of cloth would not compete with northern English mills. But he covers such a broad span of history in a really concise way that I think gets across. He doesn't come across with black and white thinking. He does talk about some ways that things that happened in the British Empire have helped India, but not. He talks about how that was not intentional. Writes in such an accessible way that it really works for people who are not aware of this history. And it talks about British imperial nostalgia and the fact that 59% of people thought the British Empire was something to be proud of. Nearly half believed countries were better off for having been colonised. Tharoor talks about the monstrous crime that was committed against the Indian people, and also debunks the idea of pre-colonial Indian society as backwards and savage. And then the final book that I would like to recommend that combines a lot of the themes of this, so beautiful, incredibly written language, love stories and relationships between people, and a look at injustice and history, is The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. This is set on a plantation in the American South in the 19th century, and is about two boys who are enslaved on this plantation and who fall in love, and the ramifications of that. We go from multiple different perspectives through the course of this novel. I think that we never come back to a perspective, from a collective voice of the ancestors of these two boys to the boys themselves, the woman who has essentially raised them, and the slave owners themselves, as well as a enslaved man who has become a preacher, bringing Christianity to the enslaved people, and the way that this affects the boys as well. It is a really tense novel that doesn't shy away from the horrors of slavery, and also manages to tell from the perspective of the slave owners the ways that they justify things to themselves, particularly the son who doesn't see himself as bad as his parents, without ever straying over the line that some do of trying to make you empathise with the slaveholders. The Prophets doesn't do that at all. You can see the hypocrisy of the ways that they justify things to themselves. It has a lot of biblical references that I think did go a little over my head because I was raised without religion. It is really wonderfully, beautifully, poetically written, and again, the relationships, the love, is so tender and warm, but of course heart-rending things happen over the course of the novel, and the ways that people manage to survive. It is a really moving, beautiful piece of fiction. The setting is richly evoked, the characters are richly evoked, their relationships feel very real and tangible, and overall it's just such a wonderful, powerful, beautiful novel. Those are the 12, I think, books that I would recommend for Libras. What do you think? Are you a Libra? Do you think that these would appeal to you? Or do you have any other books that you think would fit with this theme? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Thank you for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!